Majorities of both America's Senate and America's House of Representatives want to pass a foreign aid bill to provide aid to Ukraine, Taiwan, and Israel. But domestic politics and the increasingly radical GOP have stonewalled that aid, leaving democracy abroad in peril. Francis Fukuyama joins the podcast to discuss this bill, politics, and the international order. Frank is a senior fellow at Stanford's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. He's the author of books like The End of History and The Last Man, The Origins of Political Order, Identity, and many more. And you can find his writing at the blog Frankly Fukuyama at AmericanPurpose.org. He joins the podcast to discuss the failures of U.S. politics, the danger to democratic norms from the GOP, how identity and social media play into our domestic politics, and the current threats to liberalism all around the world. As always, if you like the podcast, we'd always appreciate your likes, your recommendations, your comments. If you really enjoy the podcast, please consider becoming a member of the Center for New Liberalism, who sponsors this podcast. You can do that at cnliberalism.org/become-a-member. Get involved with a local chapter in your city, join our community Slack and find out all the events that we're doing, become a member of our Sticker of the Month Club, get access to bonus episodes of the podcast, all of that when you become a member of the Center for New Liberalism. You can also support us on Patreon at patreon.com/newliberalpodcast. As always, we appreciate your support so much. Thank you for listening and enjoy the episode. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the New Liberal Podcast, part of the Center for New Liberalism. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and joining us this episode is Francis Fukuyama. Frank, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
It's always a delight to have you, and, you know, it's if you're anything like me, you've probably been watching in a mixture of fascination and horror as the United States desperately tries to pass a foreign aid package to help Ukraine and a few other countries, Israel and Taiwan, and we just don't seem to be able to get out of our own way to pass it. How have you been kind of reacting to kind of the mess that's been happening in the U.S.'s domestic politics?
Well, first of all, you have to define who the we is. What's frustrating about the current fight in Congress is that a majority of both the Senate and the House support this Ukraine aid. And even within the Republican Party, you had 17 senators that voted against the rest of their party to pass the bill. You have a number of people in the Republican House that are good supporters of Ukraine, but you're kind of trapped by a minority within a minority, given the rules, the institutional rules that the House faces. The Speaker is constrained by the fact that any single member of his caucus can basically oust him, and so he has to follow the rules of the most radical of that group. And then you've got Donald Trump hovering in the wings, who's basically giving instructions to Mike Johnson, and his interest is completely selfish. I mean, he doesn't want the border issue solved, so therefore he was opposed to the deal that combined this foreign aid package with really very important steps to strengthen the southern border. He wants to keep that as an issue into the election so that he can continue to bash the Democrats over it, even though Biden has offered to completely close the southern border if that's what it took. And so it's a feature of the depolarization. When I said you got to define the we, it's not the American people or the American Congress in general. It's the Republican Party that has grown incredibly dysfunctional, and they've been putting on this clown show really ever since the 2022 election that brought them this extremely narrow majority and therefore gave tremendous leverage to this extremist faction within their own conference.
I'd love to ask about that, because I see kind of this natural juxtaposition between the Nancy Pelosi Congress that we had for several years, where the Democrats had a very, very narrow majority in the House, about the same size, 4 or 5 seats, and yet Nancy Pelosi able to very kind of masterfully control her caucus and pass, a large amount of very, very significant bills, $1 trillion infrastructure and spending bills and COVID relief bills and things like that. And generally things just worked and actually functioned pretty well. And the GOP, faced with a similar kind of, very slim majority in the House, has just fallen apart. And I guess the question there is, to what do we attribute that? Is it that Nancy Pelosi as an individual is just better at her job? Is it that the Republican Party is more beset by some of these kind of extremist polarizing factors, whereas the Democrats are able, are not as polarized internally? How would you kind of contrast those things?
Well, the parties are very different. I mean, the Democrats are actually much more diverse than the Republicans today. The MAGA faction in the Republican Party has steadily been pushing out all of the centrist Republicans, and a lot of them have decided not to run. The latest victim of this was Mike Gallagher, who was actually a very, I think, competent chair of the special committee looking at China. But he's decided he's not going to run. He did this after he voted against the impeachment of Mayorkas because he thought it was just a stupid idea, which it is. But he knew that he couldn't survive in the party under those conditions. The Democrats, have the squad, and they've got a progressive wing that has been very active, especially since October 7th. But it's only a fairly small part of the party. And Pelosi was able to, use the usual skills of a good politician to build coalitions. The Republicans, by contrast, are so ideologically committed to not working at all with the Democrats, and so committed to a certain agenda, even within their own Republican ranks, that compromise is something that they equate to betrayal or weakness, and therefore they've been tripping over themselves and not being able to accomplish any of the things that they claim they want to do.
I want to come back to the domestic politics in a little bit, but it's useful to kind of remind ourselves of the stakes of what we're talking about here. And we can start with Ukraine, because I think that's kind of a flashpoint for a lot of the conflict that we see right now. There's a wing of the GOP that doesn't want to send money to Ukraine. And, there's a wing of the GOP that does. But, the conflict in Ukraine really is, in a sense, kind of a Fukuyama in kind of conflict between, a country that wants to become a liberal democracy. It's not been a liberal democracy. It's still struggling with corruption and a lot of other things. Ukraine is by no means a perfect country. But, in the sense of one of your classic phrases, we're all trying to get to Denmark. If you talk to young people in Ukraine, they want to be Denmark. They very much want to be a European liberal democratic country, and they're fighting for that. And obviously, Russia is trying to make sure that doesn't happen. Russia thinks of them as kind of a historical vassal state, and Putin in particular just is dead set against that ever happening. And I'm curious, when you look at Ukraine, are you reminded of that kind of, end of history view that we're still all just focused on liberal democracy? Through several hundred years now, we're, even the young people, even in Ukraine, that's still their guiding light, right?
I think that's very much the case. I started working personally in Ukraine in 2013, just before the Maidan Revolution of Dignity. We at Stanford, at my center, we've been running a bunch of leadership training programs for young Ukrainians, because we recognized back then that they were going to be a key country, that they did have these huge problems with corruption and poor governance, but they were a genuine democracy. I mean, you can say anything you want in Ukraine, and you're not going to be sent to jail the way you would be in Russia. And so we, have several hundred graduates of our different programs, Stanford programs in Ukraine, some of whom have risen to very influential positions. And I think that the thing to say about the Russian invasion is that it's very infrequent in international affairs that you have an event that presents this kind of moral clarity. Americans are constantly being criticized, I think fairly, for dividing the world up into good guys and bad guys. And it turns out that the good guys are really not as good as they thought they were, because things are much more complicated. This one, I mean, there are problems on the Ukrainian side, but in terms of the moral balance of the case that the Russians make versus the Ukrainian ones, I just think there's no question that Ukraine is a democracy, Russia is an authoritarian expansionist power. The Russians have committed war crimes. The Russians in their own society have created this really brutal dictatorship, and it's a pretty black and white moral issue. If you go to Gaza, that's an example of a much more morally complicated case, because obviously the Hamas attack on October 7th was a horrible act, a very brutal act of terrorism. But the Israeli response since then has also been, pretty brutal itself. And so the rights and wrongs of that go back, years and years. And
sadly, very predictable that, what one big thing happens and immediately, well, this is just going to lead to, frankly, a wild overreaction. And not that Israel shouldn't have responded, but, we all knew that there was just going to be more war crimes in the future from both directions, frankly. And I'm very pessimistic about that. I don't know how to see a way out of that mess. But
yeah, no, I am too. And I think that, that's much more typical of things that happen in international affairs where there's arguments that you can make on both sides. But Ukraine was never like that. This is simply a country that was living peacefully and was attacked by its neighbor that wants to gobble it up and cause it to cease to exist. And that seems to me, for people that believe in democracy, that's a pretty terrible thing to happen. And, American support was actually being very effective. And now that the Republicans have voted to cut off aid, the Ukrainians could well lose this war and the country could be occupied by Russia. All of the people that we were working with in Ukraine would then either have to flee the country or they'd be arrested. We already know that the Russians had a list when they invaded in February 2 years ago that included a lot of our former students. So it's a issue that I care deeply about, and it's not going well right now.
In terms of the anti-Ukraine sentiment we see here at home, there's kind of two theories that I've seen bandied about as to why the right in particular has kind of been so strenuously in objection to this. Part of it is that this is kind of a turn to isolationism, that in a similar way that there were people who wanted the U.S. to never enter World War I or never enter World War II. Just isolationism is a theme of American history for a long time. And maybe it's just a return to that. It's just don't spend money overseas, stop getting involved in wars. The other theory that I see is that this is kind of a preference for authoritarian right-leaning countries, that, in the age of the Trumpist GOP, that we simply like Putin better than we like democratic Europe. And whether that's because Putin is a right-leaning authoritarian who kind of uses things like Christian values. I'm not sure how genuinely he believes that stuff, but he certainly signals that kind of thing, that, we just like him better. And I don't know if that has any validity to it, but I don't know that I can dismiss it right away either. So I'm curious how you see the origins of that.
Well, certainly, there's a more reasonable argument that could be made about, domestic priorities and, should we really be spending that much money given other concerns we've got? So that's a pretty standard argument. But what's really disturbing is that the moral evaluation of Russia and Ukraine is flipped from what it should be. So a lot of MAGA conservatives consider Russia to be the bulwark of Western civilization defending against degenerate values, that Zelensky represents the LGBTQ movement and wants to impose woke ideology over his country and then every other country in the world, which is just, it's totally absurd. I mean, Ukraine is a liberal country, and yes, they tolerate gays and lesbians, and Russia does not. But that's not a reason to invade them. The thing about isolationism that's very disturbing is that in the old days, isolationists said, we in America have a great democratic republic, and we don't want it to be corrupted by foreign entanglements, by, messy deals with other countries that don't share our values, and we just want to live in peace. The thing that's happened on the right is that this moral evaluation of the United States has flipped. And so today, a lot of MAGA types say America is an evil country. It's got corrupt institutions. It's selling this woke ideology all over the world. And in a way, we have to be isolationist in order to protect the world from America, because we don't, America has been exporting, these horrible ideas. And so it's a really weird, change in the way that the right looks at the United States, because all during the Cold War, it was the opposite, right? It was the left that said America is an imperialist, warmongering country. It's interesting that Trump uses the word warmonger repeatedly, and in fact, in relation to this aid bill, he has criticized the United States for being a warmonger, and so there's been this convergence between the old left and this new MAGA right in terms of what they think of the United States.
There's a real sense, I think, in which anti-Americanism is kind of a driving ideology on the extremes, and it doesn't really matter whether you're identifying as a communist or kind of a hard right MAGA type or whatever you may have. The anti-Americanism runs through all of it, and yeah, I think there's you could make a legitimate argument in some direction for some of this, like certainly the EU needs to do more to pull its weight. The NATO allies, despite the increased threat from Russia, Germany is still not spending 2% of its GDP on defense like they're pledged to. And there's some reasonable arguments you can make. But I don't know. I wonder if this isn't like an overreaction from the era of like Iraq and Afghanistan, where there's some sense in which like we're always overreacting to the last thing. With the fall of communism, it was like, well, liberal democracy is easy. All these liberal democracies sprang up in Eastern Europe. So if we go to Iraq and we toss out Saddam Hussein, it'll be really easy to get a liberal democracy going, right? And that was an overreaction in a certain direction, and that failed. But I'm now wondering if like we've overreacted in the sense of, well, never try to help anyone anywhere, never get involved in any military adventure anywhere in the world, because it always ends in disaster. And we've kind of flipped the script there.
Well, that's certainly driving a lot of this. I think if Iraq and Afghanistan hadn't happened, you wouldn't have this kind of hostility to further, foreign adventures. But I don't think it really captures the craziness that exists on the right at the present moment, because, the descent into just outright conspiracy theory mongering is really extraordinary. There's a poll that showed that something like a quarter of all Americans believed some version of, these various QAnon theories. Majority of Republicans think that vaccines are really bad for you. Trump himself has been using QAnon, symbology. So QAnon is not a rational response to Iraq and Afghanistan. It was just crazy.
Taylor Swift is a deep state psyop, and the Chiefs winning the Super Bowl was planned to get people to vote for Joe Biden. That's the latest flavor of this.
The stuff is insane. And so I just think that, we're used to trying to explain these things in political science. We used to have what I regarded all the time as a kind of ridiculous framework of rational choice. Political scientists trying to copy economists, kind of neoclassical economics, and saying, people are rational actors. They have preferences and they'll vote, rationally according to these preferences. But I think that what the last few years have revealed is that, political preferences are just, I mean, they're completely unpredictable because, we're living in such a scrambled cognitive universe in which there's really no agreement on basic factual information. Who won the 2020 election? Are vaccines actually safe? Or is this actually a deep state conspiracy, against ordinary Americans? So, that's what I think makes today's world really quite different from, and again, this stuff existed. We had the John Birch Society. When I was a kid, I remember all these, you know, just extraordinary theories about the communist global conspiracy, and everything bad that happened in the world was the deliberate work of, somebody in Moscow or Beijing. So it always existed, but it was always, pretty marginal. But now it's kind of come into mainstream politics in a way that I think is going to be hard to, rid ourselves of.
Well, and you wrote a book that I think is really, really underrated. Everybody knows some of the other big name books, but your book Identity is one of my favorite things that I've read in the last few years, because there's a sense in which, I like to say all politics is identity politics on some level. And normally that means like, oh, well, black people care about Black Lives Matter. But in a deeper sense, a lot of what Donald Trump does is identity politics. He's created the MAGA identity that is, you wouldn't be too far off in equating it to a religion. And it's saying it's got its symbology, it's holy icons, it's sacred texts, and it's hated outgroup and all of that stuff. And I'm curious how you think the identity portion of this has contributed to kind of what we're seeing on the right.
Well, I think that identity politics really begins on the left among progressives, who begin to argue that true inequality, is related not to broad classes like the proletariat, but to very much narrower groups based on race, gender, sexual orientation, and the like. And that's been with us, for the last 40 years. But I think that it spawned its equivalent on the right, where a lot of conservatives feel that they are a persecuted minority. And there's, empirically, there's reason for them to worry. I mean, the United States used to be a very Christian and very church-going country. It was always very different from Europe, where the European societies had mostly secularized by the end of the 20th century. But that hadn't been true of the United States, but it's becoming true. So the number of self-proclaimed Christians has fallen quite dramatically in the last 20 years. And you have, obviously a change in the racial and ethnic composition of the country. I think there's another really important factor that is sometimes overlooked. This was actually the subject of my least read book, The Great Disruption, that I published in 1999. But the shift from a industrial to an information economy has led to this massive change in the role of women in the society, because women are simply better suited to sitting behind a computer working in a service industry than they were working in a big factory or on a construction site or whatnot. And so you've had, hundreds of millions of women across the Western world entering the workforce over the last couple of generations. And in an information economy, a lot of them do better than, their partners, their male partners. And so they're ending up as heads of households. In effect, they're the ones that are bringing back the resources. And this combination of things, the decline of Christianity, the shifting racial composition of the country, and the diminished role of men, it's kind of a triple whammy that's hit a lot of, especially working class white men. And, it's led to their self-perception as victims of a conspiracy. It's not a conspiracy. I mean, it's not as if there's some feminist mastermind that's been directing women to start working and displace their husbands. It's just a fact of technological change that's brought this about. But that's not the way it's perceived by many people, and I think this has contributed to right-wing identity politics, where being in one of these groups, white, conservative, kind of male-centered, brings you a lot of social opprobrium and the feeling that you're actually the real victim in the contemporary U.S.
One kind of counter to that narrative, which frankly I buy into. I agree with a lot of the stuff that you're saying, but one counter that I've heard to kind of what we're talking about is that surprisingly, the GOP, and specifically the Trump GOP, has been making inroads with Black and Latino voters. And this is cause for a lot of alarm in the Democratic circles that I run in when they see Trump is nearly tied with Joe Biden in the 2024 election with Latino voters. And it depends what poll you look at. It goes up and down, but they've certainly made gains. And on one hand, for a good liberal like me, I am flabbergasted at the idea that, Latinos in particular would vote for Trump. But it does speak to something that I don't know if it's a particular kind of masculinity that he appeals to, or just a certain blue collar aesthetic, or if it's actually just a policy agreement in some way. I'm curious what you think about that. Have you thought about kind of...
Yeah, well, I mean, so I was saying that there are three categories where you could claim victimhood based on race, based on gender, and based on religion. So obviously, Hispanics and Blacks don't feel the loss of, their majority position as a racial majority. But on the other two cases, the role, the masculinity issue and the religion issue, they participate in those cultural identities as much as, working class white men do. And so I think, and actually, what makes me think that's true is that the loss among African Americans to Trump, for example, is really heavily skewed towards men. Black women are still, pretty reliably in the Democratic camp, and that suggests that it is, this gender issue and the loss of status as a male that, may be driving some of that resentment. The other thing is that, quite frankly, a lot of the progressive left just espouses ridiculous things that don't make any sense to working class people. And so I think a lot of, in terms of transgender, this is a category that is marginalized and in a liberal society needs to be treated with equal dignity and respect. But, the movement and the activists within the movement bring in an ideology that I think a lot of people find very hard to take, that gender is something that's completely voluntary and, every young person growing up needs to decide which gender they're going to participate in. And you take that kind of argument to a working class, neighborhood, and they'll say, where are these people from Mars? What are they talking about? So I do think that there is that element that is driving a lot of people in a conservative direction.
I want to switch back to a little bit more of the international picture. And, obviously Russia's invasion of Ukraine has been the biggest story of the last few years. And that, along with a few other things, the rise of authoritarian China, and not to list too many other examples, but there's, troubling signs in countries like Brazil and Turkey, and in Eastern Europe, you've got Hungary and Poland. And it's led to this debate back and forth about, is illiberalism on the rise? Is authoritarianism on the rise? And what does this mean for liberal democracy? And as someone who's obviously a big fan of liberal democracy, I'm sure you've thought about this quite a lot and you've written about it. But I'd love to just kind of take your temperature here in the year 2024 as we're kicking things off. How serious do you think this wave of kind of illiberalism is? And how much should the liberal democratic community of the world be worried about it? And is this, I guess, any different from the challenges we've had before? Is this a different thing that requires more worry? Or is this just similar to waves of authoritarianism we've had and gotten past, in past generations?
Well, I think it's serious and we should worry about it. I think that we also have to remember that we've seen, prior periods, as you noted, where comparable things have happened. This happened in the 1970s with the oil crisis and, the rise of, at that point, a Soviet Union that was very self-confident. You had, obviously, the 1930s and 40s where you had a really serious threat to liberal democracy that we managed to survive. So it's not unprecedented, but it is, I think, different in the sense that this lack of confidence in liberal values in liberal countries above all the United States is something that I don't think was present to nearly the degree in those earlier periods as today. But on the optimistic side, people are fighting back. I mean, NATO actually turned out to be much more resilient than anyone thought it would be after the Russian invasion. You had an election in Brazil. You had another one in Poland in which, populist candidates had been turned back. So, I think there's still hope. I think that, our election coming up in the United States is going to be really important for the rest of the world, just given the role that the U.S. has played being a bulwark of democracy. And if we lose confidence in ourselves, then that's going to be a bad signal to give to every other struggling country. There are actually a couple of stories that a lot of people haven't been following, but the Myanmar military staged a coup, deposed Aung San Suu Kyi back in, I think, 2019, and they may fall this year. There's been an insurgency, kind of alliance of both ethnic armies and the pro-democracy forces there, and we just talked to their foreign minister in exile, and she thinks that the regime is not going to last the year. So there's opportunities for pushback, and I think that it's important that we not get overly convinced that we're on the losing side, because that could become a self-fulfilling prophecy.
I think it's a really important observation, what you said about kind of declining faith in liberal, small L liberalism in liberal democracies, because I feel like liberal democracy is the thing that keeps proving itself, over and over throughout the last several hundred years of history. It's very resilient. When there's an aggressive fascist power, we were able to defeat it in World War II. And when there's the Soviet Union wasn't as aggressive as the Nazis, they didn't start World War III, but we were able to kind of outlast them until the point of, the contradictions of Soviet communism collapsed. And so those kind of things don't worry me. I don't think that Russia can, by itself, just from the outside, collapse Western liberalism. I don't think that China can collapse liberalism. But I do worry, if Donald Trump wins in 2024, that could be a more important collapse of liberalism. And that worries me more than some aggressive foreign power in that sense.
No, absolutely. I think that that's the single biggest threat to liberal democracy today, is that internal one. It's funny because that's what they say about liberals. That
during the Cold War, Marx always talked about, going all the way back to Marx, the contradictions of capitalism, which capitalism is not the same thing as liberal democracy, but they're pretty closely linked in most most instances. And in fact, capitalist liberal democracies have been very flexible and very, they take a punch and keep on going, it seems like.
Right.
I want to ask quickly about a couple of the other conflicts going on in the world right now. And my focus for this, because what I've kind of been just obsessed with the last few weeks, is this foreign aid package. And Ukraine is a big part of that. But a part of that gets talked about less and less is Taiwan. Taiwan is actually earmarked to receive aid in that as well.
Mm-hmm.
And Taiwan has just elected their third straight DPP president. And this is the Greens. It's the Greens versus the Blues in Taiwan. And the DPP traditionally being the power that is a little bit more distant from China, a little bit closer to, independence, although they don't formally say they want independence. But this is, a lot of people are now worried that because Taiwan keeps electing this kind of anti-China party, that China might, and Xi might take the moment and at some point just decide it's time to attack China, or it's time to attack Taiwan. It's time to finally take it back. How closely do you follow that? Are you worried about Chinese aggression against Taiwan? Is that something we should be focused on?
Yes, absolutely. I think that the Ukraine invasion woke a lot of people up, especially in East Asia, to the possibility that a great power could actually just take its military and cross an international border and, occupy another country. I think this hadn't been taken seriously by many people, especially in Asia, but I think now they do. I think that you know, China and Xi in particular have made it pretty clear that they want to reincorporate Taiwan. The question is, what level of risk and on what timetable do they want to do it? But the PLA has been preparing for this contingency above all others. That's really, a lot of their raison d'etre. Um, I think where you'll get disagreement is on whether Xi himself is actually going to move in that direction. He does not strike me as the kind of risk taker like Putin. Putin is crazy, in terms of the risks that he has been willing to take in terms of putting troops in other countries and launching invasions. There isn't a lot in Xi's background that indicates that he's willing to take that level of risk, but it depends on a deterrence calculation. Clearly, a cross-strait invasion is going to be a pretty demanding scenario, and whether he could actually pull it off or whether it's going to suck him into a conflict the way Russia got sucked in, something he's got to worry about. But I do think that, unfortunately, we're back in this geopolitical world where things like deterrence matter, and part of Xi's calculation is going to depend on how he anticipates the rest of the world, and in particular the US and Japan, will react. And therefore, I think that we've got to think very carefully about what our response will be.
There's a couple of schools of thought on this, and I find myself fascinated by the idea that, some people think a rising China is more of a threat to Taiwan. Obviously, the more powerful China becomes, the more this could become a reality. Some people think a falling China is more of a threat because, if China's economy is in really bad shape, and by many metrics it is, and if their future looks more grim, then maybe they will distract themselves, or the government will say what we need is something like an invasion of Taiwan to rouse the patriotic spirit or something. Just make the story no longer about the economy. There's the theory that a great power is never more dangerous than when they're about to start declining, and they know they're going to start declining. And therefore, if they're ever going to act, the time is now. I'm conflicted because I don't know enough to really be an expert here, but I do think there's kind of these different assessments of how legitimate the risk is right now and whether it's increasing or not.
Yeah, I don't think that anybody really knows the answer to that, because you can construct theories that say that the risk will go up and down and that China's increasing or decreasing. I mean, I'm pretty certain that we've kind of seen peak China. I think that its economy is going to perform much more poorly over the next 20 years than it certainly has in the past 20. Some of that is just getting caught in a middle income trap like everyone else, but part of it is a result of bad policy decisions that Xi Jinping has made. But as you say, that doesn't really tell you very much about what effect that's going to have on foreign policy, because you can make an argument that they got to act now before the decline really hits them. So I think that we're in a position where we have to kind of assume the worst, that the kind of planning we have to do um, needs to take into account, China, regardless of what its long-term prospects are, has an objective with regard to Taiwan, the South China Sea, other parts of Asia, and we have to be prepared to deter uh, military action on their part.
The third part of the aid package that's been, floating around there is Israel. And the idea of this aid package is we're sending money to Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan all at once. And traditionally, these have been three kind of allies, Israel and Taiwan for a long time of the United States, and Ukraine more recently. But where you see ideological disagreement coming from the left rather than the right is in the idea of sending more money to Israel. And this is something the U.S. has done for a long time, but it's under renewed scrutiny now because of what's going on in Gaza and kind of the inhumanity of some of the what Israel's doing there, to put it lightly. I'm curious how you think about like this foreign aid to Israel in light of what we've seen in the last few months, because whenever you do give foreign aid to a country, you have to ask, like, what are we accomplishing? Are we trying to just help this country accomplish a specific thing? Like in Ukraine, we just want them to drive out the Russians. Are we trying to, influence the country? And by giving this to Israel, they're dependent on us, and therefore they will act in a way we find more acceptable. There's a couple different theories here, but I'm kind of in agreement to some extent where I don't understand necessarily what the foreign aid to Israel is supposed to accomplish. And I'm curious how you think about this in the current day.
Well, I'm not privy to discussions in the White House. I suspect that the reason that Israel assistance is there is to help buy more Republican support for the bill, because the Republicans care a lot more about this. The Democrats have got a left wing that is completely opposed to this. And so, from that conference itself, they're not going to, they wouldn't be doing this. But I think as a sweetener to get Republicans to vote for the Ukraine package, that's why it's there. I think it's interesting what's happened on the progressive left. Identity politics has defined what it means to be a progressive in the United States that's what my identity book was really about, that in the 20th century, people on the left worried about equality in terms of these broad social classes, the bourgeoisie and proletariat, but now it's much more focused on specific racial, ethnic, gender, sexual orientation identities. And you see this very much in the response of the left to the October 7th attack, because, it's one thing after 3-4 months of war and tens of thousands of Palestinian casualties to say, well, maybe enough is enough. But a lot of the hostility to Israel was expressed, at the moment that 1,400 Israelis had just been, murdered by Hamas. And that's a real change. I think that, the support for Israel on the part of both parties was something that could be taken for granted. I think that's the world that Joe Biden grew up in, where, as a candidate, nobody would really be harmed by being seen as too pro-Israel. But that is in the process of changing, because I think a lot of the left has now, defined itself in terms of support for these identity struggles, and the fact that, the Palestinians are, a non-white group that has been oppressed, matters much more than it would have, 30, 40 years ago.
It's interesting you say that specifically, because I really find that the American progressive left very much tries to racialize certain conflicts, like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The Israelis are white colonizers and the Palestinians are brown, native oppressed people.
Mm-hmm.
But that's very much not the case. Like if you look at a picture of a typical Israeli and a typical Palestinian, they're the same people. In a sense of like very much skin tone wise and just feature wise. Not that there should be any reason for anybody to care about this, but you could pick, put them in a who's who kind of guessing game. Most people would not be able to guess. Like there is no like white versus black, thing like we have in America, where we've got this very racialized history of slavery, and I feel like progressives try to impose kind of their identitarian politics onto conflicts where it doesn't really make any sense.
Well, we love to project our own conflicts, everywhere else in the world. There was this case with Netflix that they had a movie about Cleopatra, and she was cast as a black woman, and the Egyptians got really outraged at this and said, she wasn't black. Egyptians are a Semitic people, and that's just you Americans trying to understand the whole world in terms of your own hang-ups. We definitely do that a lot.
How do you think social media plays into this? And I'll kind of preface this with why I'm asking this question, because I write personally a lot about social media and the social internet and the effect it has on our culture and our politics. This is a topic of fascination for me, and I have a whole Substack about it that I spend way too much time online. I'm one of those terminally online people. But where you see a lot of the things that we're talking about, whether it's like the craziest MAGA conspiracy theories and where they are born and where they flourish and where they really get life, is in social media spaces. It's through the internet. And where you look at, the progressive left and how they, 10 minutes after the attacks on October 7th, they've declared, well, all those Israelis deserve to die and they deserve to be murdered in their homes because they're colonizers. And this extends into things like, leftist celebrities who are pro-Houthi in Yemen, that, the Houthis being literal, like religious fascist pro-slavery, like they literally have slave markets in the parts of Yemen that the Houthis control. And yet leftists have somehow if they're firing at ships, it can only be a good thing because it is by some 3D checkers and chess thing. It's anti-American. But where you see this, it's not in Congress. AOC is not saying this stuff. It's like people who are terminally online. And so I think all the time about does social media just tend itself towards extremism as by its nature?
Well, I think there's a couple of things that are happening. It's certainly the case that social media allows a kind of mass reaction to events on a scale and with a speed that no previous form of media permitted. And that amplifies, certain ideas. And a lot of times the first reactions are, based on just ignorance or lack of adequate information, but that doesn't stop people from expressing opinions. But the other problem is the tech companies and the technology itself, which is used to amplify. I mean, this is a longstanding charge against the internet platforms, that their business models depend on the number of clicks, and the way you get clicks is by putting, inflammatory, salacious, material in front of people, and they've therefore got a monetary self-interest in amplifying, messages that are not good for the society, but are good for their bottom lines. And I think that continues to be the case. There's a Wall Street Journal reporter that just wrote a book about Meta, about Facebook, in which it was kind of an amazing story. I'm not sure I'm going to get this completely right, but they had a memo about the way that they were encouraging people to have a lot of friends, and they found out that a huge amount of their traffic came from users of Facebook who were acquiring more than 100 friends a day. Now, if you think of who is it that would acquire more than 100 friends a day, day in, day out, 24/7, this has to be some kind of an organized operation that is deliberately generating traffic and volume. Because no sane person would, we have a lot of insane people that might aspire to do something like this. So, the managers at Facebook got this memo. If I think they had been acting in a responsible way, they would have said no. I mean, we're not going to try to focus just on these 100 a day friendsters, maybe 10 a day or something like that. But instead, they said, "Great, okay, that's generating a lot of traffic for us, and we want to encourage this." And so, I just think there's evidence, that the platforms themselves are, in an important way responsible for this amplification of bad content. And
when you lean too hard into optimizing for one particular metric, all your other values will get thrown under the bus eventually, because
right.
You're just optimizing for one metric, clicks
right.
in this instance.
Right. Yeah, and that's a reality that we've still not dealt with adequately, because there was this big uproar after Cambridge Analytica, and a lot of pressure on the platforms to clamp down on this sort of behavior. They seem to have responded in certain ways, but then the right, decided that this was all directed against them, and they began attacking the tech companies. And so they're now sort of caught between, the two poles of the polarization in the United States. And I think that we don't want the government to be intervening and setting the rules for engagement. We don't want these large private companies, for-profit companies, to be making these kinds of decisions. But we don't have a real alternative that would, guide content moderation so that this sort of thing, doesn't happen. Europeans have been trying, but I'm not sure that they've been terribly successful at this either.
Yeah, European tech regulation is not something that I think is a shining beacon of success. There's a fun anecdote where Europeans and very, very seriously say that, well, America can lead the world in technology. We will lead the world in technology regulation. And that's where it's very funny that they see themselves in that role. But there are no large European tech companies to a first extent. Spotify is basically it. But I don't know. I look at the social interactions we have online, and as you said, the speed and kind of the global reach that is very, very new. And I can't help but think, going back to the identity argument, that social media kind of turbocharges a certain kind of identity formation. It makes it so easy to kind of define yourself by these different groups, which maybe you would have never even known existed otherwise.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. I think a lot of social identities are really formed, online these days, and that can be very problematic, because I think that online relationships are just very different from, normal human relationships.
Well, and just the standards of behavior are very different. Things you would never say to somebody in person. Even I fall into this. I try not to be. I am aware of the fact that this happens, and it still happens. But I'm a much bigger jerk to people online than I would ever be in real life. And I really try hard not to be. But if somebody says something snippy to me, then I'll be snippy back, and it turns into yelling at each other. And I don't know, just it's very easy to kind of polarize yourself in a sense. That
my solution to that is just to never read the comments on anything I post.
That's probably a good thing.
Yeah.
If you are more offline than online, I genuinely think that's better for your mental health, better for your sanity. I can't say that is me, because I'm hopelessly addicted, but it is what it is.
Right.
So we're coming up on time here. I want to ask the traditional final question that we always ask on this podcast, and that is, what would you recommend people to read or people to look up that would help them understand what we've been talking about today? If they're interested in what we're talking about in terms of liberal democracy versus authoritarianism, in terms of identity and how social media plays into this, what would you recommend that they do in terms of books, blog posts, podcasts to listen to? I will start and say I'm happy to recommend you should check out Frankly Fukuyama on AmericanPurpose.com. It's a great series that Frank writes for American Purpose, and it has a lot of his thoughts, and it's really, really good. So you should go check that out. you should probably check out some of Frank's books. Like we've mentioned Identity here, which is a really, really strong one. But other than yourself, I'm happy to recommend you. Other than yourself, what would you recommend for people to read who are interested in all this stuff?
Yeah, that's a really hard question to answer because there's so many possible directions you can go. I'll just tell you a couple of books that.
We're only talking about all of geopolitics. How hard could it be, right?
Yeah, I think that on geopolitics, on the whole Ukraine-Russia fight, the stuff that Anne Applebaum has written, and she's written a couple. She wrote a whole book on the Holodomor, the famine that was deliberately caused by Stalin in Ukraine, as just general background to that conflict. A couple of books that I have read in the last month is Tim Alberta's The Kingdom, Power, and the Glory. So he is a journalist that comes out of the evangelical movement. His father was an evangelical pastor, and it's a really amazing dissection of what's going on the religious right. His argument is that essentially conservative Christianity has been stripped of its theological content, and all of that is now replaced by right-wing politics. And so for many people, what it means to be a Christian is to vote for Donald Trump and to support Trump's policies. The other book I just finished reading is Jonathan Karl. So he's an ABC reporter that's covered politics for years and written several books. The latest one is basically about Trump's behavior since January 6th. And it has a lot of revelations in it that may have escaped the notice. But I do think, because I think the coming election is so important, what I find very frustrating is that a lot of Americans aren't paying attention, and they kind of think that this is just another election where we're voting on candidates that represent different policy positions, right? So immigration.
Just to support that, there's some crazy number that I've seen where something like 25% of voters don't think that it will be Donald Trump versus Joe Biden. Like
No,
they
right.
literally just don't believe Donald Trump's not running again or Joe Biden's not running again. Which is crazy kind of at this point. Yeah.
It's absolutely true. And the thing about this Carl book is that it kind of reminds you in all sorts of little anecdotes and accounts of, Trump's behavior, how an awful a person he is. He cheats at golf on his own golf courses. Little things like that. But, the one big revelation was that Carl asked him, what was he thinking when, on January 6th, all of his supporters were calling to hang Mike Pence? And Trump's response to that was, well, they were very angry. His own vice president. And he's, in a sense, justifying, those that wanted to kill his own vice president. And I think that it's something that you have to bear in mind when you cast your vote next November, that this is not an ordinary election. And whatever you think of, Biden's policies and Biden as a person, there are some really, really deep stakes. I think, that was underlined by this speech he just gave in South Carolina, where he called on Russia, in effect, to go ahead and attack, NATO allies if they haven't, according to him, paid their dues, because it's really important. It's important to America, and I think it's going to be super important to the rest of the world.
Yeah, one of the things we say on this podcast a lot is that institutions have to come before policies. If you degrade your institutions in order to get a policy victory, it's never worth it. You have to be committed to liberal institutions, and just the basic stuff, the rule of law, the peaceful transition of power, equal rights for people, no matter your age, race, sex, etc. Kind of sacrificing those things is the path that we don't want to go down ever. So
right.
Full agreement there. Yeah. Well, I guess that wraps things up for us. I do want to say one more time, thank you so much for coming on the show, Francis Fukuyama.
Okay, Jeremiah, thank you very much for having me.